think the first thing that any employer does in a unionized environment is the contract. Try to see what provision of the contract applies to the situation. In terms of the current time, there's no practice for what any of us are dealing with these issues. Good.
So, Howard, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good, good. Where are you today?
I am in my home office where I've been working for the past few months.
Yeah.
Since I was last in my New York City office, which has been closed for quite a bit of time, but I'm getting used to it.
Got it. So with us today is Howard Wexler from Seyfarth Shaw, a very reputable legal firm. I've worked with Seyfarth now a few times, and obviously I worked with Howard a couple of times while I was with Crescent Hotels and Resorts. And I invited Howard because Howard's area of focus or expertise is unions and collective bargaining and union campaigns. And, you know, here we are in the middle of coronavirus, COVID-19. And I thought, how does this play out in this type of environment, right? How is collective bargaining agreement going to work? Plus, you know, I'm always interested in what's happening in terms of the law. And, you know, maybe we can touch a little bit on what may be happening with the NLRB out there. But before we jump into the topics today, I always like to start with, you know, giving you the floor, giving the guests the floor to introduce themselves. So what do you want us to know about you, Howard?
Sure. I'm Howard Wexler. I'm a partner at the New York office of Seyfarth Shaw. As you mentioned, I'm a labor and employment law attorney. I represent companies and union issues, as well as discrimination cases, labor management of all sorts, both in New York, New Jersey, and really across the country. And I'm just really happy to be here today. It's nice to have that contact. It's one of those things where prior to March, Zoom was, you heard about it, you used it a little bit, but now it's, part of my daily routine is a Zoom call. So I got
right
now. So,
I see you have your background promoting Seyfarth. That's great. That's great. That's awesome.
Prevents the Barbies that my daughters throw at me while I'm working from being part of the background. So.
Putting out there. Yeah. So, let's talk about collective bargaining agreement in light of COVID-19. What can you share with us that is happening on that front now that we're in the middle of this crisis?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that any employer does when something pops up in the workplace, and especially in a unionized environment, is, you look at the contract and you try to see what provision of the contract applies to the situation. And, most times you can find something, or it's something that's happened before. Whether it's, in the Northeast, we deal with snow emergencies of all time. So, this is our practice when this happens.
Yeah.
But, in terms of the current time, there's no practice for what any of us are dealing with these issues. So, in a lot of respects, for those employers who have unionized workforces, there's been a lot of, bargaining with the union, not necessarily, for new contracts, unless those are up, but also in terms of how you're going to deal with the issues, whether it's remote work, if that's a possibility, testing procedures, security procedures, things like that, now, especially when the government imposes upon employers face mask policies, things like that. So the parties then, still have an obligation to bargain in good faith with each other, while the employer, has to make sure that it's, while it's bargaining, but it also complies with whatever local, state, or federal laws, that are imposed upon it. So, that's one where a lot of employers who have unionized environments across different localities are dealing with issues on a, location basis, and maybe a union by union basis, depending on where the workers are located.
Yeah, I mean, there's no provision in the contract that addresses this type of situation.
No, if it is, I mean, I've seen some long collective bargaining agreements, but I don't think there's one, not like this.
Yeah. Yesterday, I was having a conversation with someone in the commercial side, and they were talking about collecting rent. And they said, our agreements, our lease agreements address, acts of God, right? But there's nothing like coronavirus that we could have think of. Now there's going to be a lot of coronavirus, written in these. Have you seen anything out of the ordinary in that exchange between the employer and the union in terms of coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of times, the company and the union have been sitting down and trying to, again, negotiate things on kind of a daily basis, especially early on, March, April, about what to do for employees in terms of who can go to work, who's essential or not essential. And again, a lot of that depended on, what the government in your specific state or locality was saying in terms of who's permitted to work. So a lot of times it was both the employer and the union wanting to reach an agreement with having the employees' interests in terms of their safety, in mind, but really not knowing because the state, was unfolding or coming up with new laws on, an hour by hour basis, back in mid, March and beyond. So I think now that, things are slowly in some locations, starting to reopen, some of those issues have subsided somewhat, but in terms of furloughs, in terms of the interplay with a lot of the laws that were passed to give employees leave and how that works with existing collective bargaining agreements. A lot of the sick laws, which most employers at this point are accustomed to, the kind of patchwork of paid sick leave laws that have developed across the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah.
So I think, how does that mesh and interplay with the laws that were passed to provide people leaves for COVID-19 related reasons? So, there's been a lot of things that employers and unions have had to sit down and try to hammer out in a pretty quick time period. It doesn't frequently happen that employers and unions are able to or have to, bargain in such a quick turnaround given what was going on here. So I think, it was a lot of work early on to try to see what we can do to reach agreements with the unions to make sure that those employees who are still able to work and get to work, can do so safely.
We were talking about the whole idea of remote work with different people that I've been talking to, including here on the show. And it was interesting to see how some employers, including my employer, we had to quickly react, right? There was no time for negotiation as to, we just got to make it happen. Yeah. Did you feel that it was almost the same with the union and the employers, kind of like, we have to figure it out, we don't have time?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially those, where I am in New York, those businesses that were still open, were those truly essential businesses, and those, employers who were allowed to still have their employees at the workplace, you needed to make sure that the protocols were in place because those people are essential. I mean, and that means something in terms of whether it's hospital workers, whether it's, transportation in terms of getting supplies and PPE and the like delivered. So, a lot of it was really unfolding in real time, and the same with remote work. Trying to figure out who can and who cannot work from home. Some employers, allow it and may have those systems in place, not on the scale that they have now, but other employers, had not entertained that or really thought of that, were really forced in a quick amount of time to figure out, who can and who can't work from home. And especially in the union environment, is that something that the contract allows? And if so, how do you carry that out?
In your experience prior to coronavirus, was remote work in collective bargaining agreements?
Not so much. It was something that in certain unionized environments, whether it's office or clerical, it was something that was talked about. I think more and more, given that remote work is being viewed as technology changes as an accommodation for disability situations and the like, I think more employers were starting to deal with it more regularly. But I think it's something now that was kind of thrust upon everybody to figure out if you can and do it. And for a lot of employers, it'll be interesting to see how things unfold in terms of what the new normal is, in terms of remote work. For some employers, employees, it was viewed as a perk, versus now it's going to be part of, even when things reopen, what does that look like? Does it look like, someone like myself taking the train, a packed Long Island Railroad train to the New York City every day, then getting in a building and riding an elevator with a lot of people? Or is it going to be more, your remote work a portion of the time and then you're in the office a portion of the time? So I think it'll be interesting to see how those things play out as, the governments come up with their respective laws about how states are going to reopen.
Yeah. I mean, certainly for certain positions, it's going to be pretty clear that the remote work is just not possible, right? If I think back to the hotels, if you have a doorman, if you have a bellman, if you have housekeeping, right, you have to be there.
Sure.
But there's all these other positions where, you can have a debate. I'm wondering, I've had conversations with some people where, their employees are debating, do we allow remote work or not? And, for many employers, probably the debate is going to be, do we want to allow it or not, versus can they work from home or not? Because in some cases, it may have been proven through this process, yep, You can work from home, but the employer may not necessarily want that as a model. How do you think that plays out in a union environment where the employer says, I get it, they can work from home, but you know what? We're not going to allow it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think to some extent, those agreements that may have been reached allowing for remote work, that was and because of it needed to happen. But then when things kind of go back to normal, maybe that's not what the employer wants as the default.
Ah,
Even myself, I can work from home. I could pick up the phone and call colleagues. We could have a Zoom meeting. But there is something to be said about that face-to-face, the
yeah.
collaboration, being in an office, and missing that, and also that being part of the job. So I think it really is going to boil down to, employer by employer, employee by employee potentially. And then if it's something that the parties, can reach an agreement about, whether it becomes part of this position or an occasional remote from work environment, I think all sides are seeing that there are benefits,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
it, with those, drawbacks being, what they are. But, maybe now if you could focus on where there's benefits to both sides, that's how, agreements are reached, where you can really find that sweet spot in terms of what makes sense for all sides.
Yeah. You know, I have to admit, the whole entire process of bargaining and going through that back and forth, it's a love-hate relationship because I love the debate part, I love the analysis part, but sometimes the confrontation that may come of it, it's kind of like, oh, all right, can I bypass that part? But I would love to be in an environment now, kind of like listening, right? Like that
Yeah.
fly on the wall, listening to that exchange because it's now
Yeah.
fascinating. Here's a new wrinkle that maybe a couple of employers had as part of their collective bargaining agreement. And now I'm wondering if some are going to be negotiating as a perk,
Yeah.
right? Not necessarily a an essential part of it, but it's a give and take. And now this is a perk that we might be able to entice the employer to give in for the benefit of the employees, at least on the eyes of the union.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great, great point. That's, could be how that's how things like this become part of contracts, is that, you've experimented with it. And now, again, you see if both sides can find some way to, put some sort of, parameters around it to make sure it's workable, going forward. And I think here the interesting thing, which is why, is just we still don't know. I mean, I think
Yeah.
as states start to reopen, what will you have to agree? I mean, for some employers, it may be an issue of necessity where we can operate, at least for the short term, in the manner in which we were before. So if we want to make sure that everyone's working, we're going to have to agree to something, where there's some level of remote work, whether it's because we need to decrease headcount for social distancing obligations or any other sort of, issue, in terms of making sure you open safely, as states are starting to go down that path.
Yeah. Now, tell me a little bit about, in this environment in particular, what are union campaigns looking like? I don't know if you were working in one and all of a sudden, it's everything is out the window and everything it's, put a pause. Tell me a little bit of what you encountered.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I myself was dealing with one, as many of my colleagues were, and we had one where we had an election that was scheduled, and then the NLRB pressed the pause button on all representation elections. So for
Oh,
about 3 weeks, any scheduled election was, postponed, from basically mid-March through early April. And then the NLRB decided, then they were going to allow representation elections to proceed. What we've seen now is, under the National Labor Relations Act, there's the traditional voting. And it's funny because now you see this being, politically, the big issue of the day, mail ballot voting.
that's
So
right.
the NLRA allows for mail ballot voting. The preference under the act, is for in-person voting. That's, there's case law to that effect, and that's not really in dispute, but mail ballot is permissible, if certain circumstances are met. So, the past month or so since the elections have started up again, or maybe now close to 2 months, we've seen a lot more mail ballot elections being the preferred, or if not really the only way for union elections to proceed, because different regional directors across the country are saying that it's not safe right now to have, an in-person vote, given the touching the ballots, the people in close quarters, observers in the room. So we're going to go with the mail ballot. That's not to say a mail ballot in terms of just those same type of concerns, touching the ballot, putting in the mail, and the like, has potential for spreading, coronavirus. But that's been the trend. So most elections that are going forward via a mail ballot, which presents new challenges for employers in terms of educating employees on how that process works. When you see some mysterious letter show up in the mail and there's a blue envelope, a yellow envelope, you put it in there. So, there's an added wrinkle that employers now who are advising and dealing in this environment are considering, because mail ballot elections, were used, but not as frequent, obviously, as they are now, whereas now that's pretty much the main way elections are proceeding.
So I was never involved in either a campaign or a vote where mail ballots became a part of the conversation. I'm wondering that in similar fashion, which ones become valid and which ones are accepted or not. What was the conversation like in that regard as to what is an acceptable ballot that is coming in through the mail?
Yeah, I mean, the NLRB has their ballot. They give, they show samples, and the employer has to post a sample so employees know what it looks like. But there's different processes that the employee has to open. They have to initial and sign and send it back. So and then when those ballots come in, if the employee doesn't sign in a certain place, the ballot could be disregarded. And just generally, based on the results that have come in since we've been tracking this, the return of mail ballots aren't as good. There's not as many people voting generally in mail ballots as in person, where it's set up in a break room. You have to pass by it on your way to your own break or on the way to your car, and you see that there's a sign NLRB election versus being part of your regular mail, which right now, especially if you're working and you're not really focused on what's coming in the mail, you're focused on safety and washing your hands when you come in from the door and the like. So making sure you're checking that mail and then you're getting it back in a timely fashion. So those are where, and generally you'll have 3 weeks from when the ballots are mailed to when they have to be back at the NLRB, which isn't that much time in terms of getting the ballot, filling it out, sending it out. So, that's kind of how the elections are proceeding, at least for the time being. Since even a lot of NLRB offices are not open, most of their employees are working remotely as well.
Wow.
And some of them have started to do, a colleague of mine has a Zoom NLRB trial coming up because they're not physically able to have open. So I think they are now, kind of getting into the swing of things as well, with things moving along with using technology to make sure that all cases don't languish. So it's the way of the world right now.
So one last question about unions then in this environment. So here you are with Zoom, right? You and I are talking through Zoom. Have you had to, how do you handle then campaigning, right? On the employer side, your employees are not there. Everybody's not there, but the same thing from the standpoint of the union. Now, technically, if, with remote distancing and social distancing, technically you're not supposed to go to the homes, but tell me a little bit about that union campaign environment and what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, talking about home visits, I mean, that's something that frequently is, used by, during the campaign in terms of people coming to your house or those meetings at the office, employers holding, meetings with the employees to educate them on, unions and, whatever the employer's position is on, on that issue. So I think that's not something that you really can do so much anymore. So a lot of it is being web-based, telephonic mailings to employees' homes, one-on-one conversations or one-on small group conversations, and not being able to have everybody come into a conference room. So I think, employers and unions, in terms of how they're trying to get the message out to employees, are having to use the same methods that we are when we're trying, given that, you're not seeing everybody necessarily face to face, especially if you're in an environment where you're not at work, where you're, where you're at home remote working. There are some employers that are going through this, but the employees are essential, so they're still working. But, you could be voting, but not be at the office. So it's impossible to have those small group meetings. So, it's an interesting time. And again, it's not something that people were thinking about, but, now we're living it.
Oh yeah. I mean, listen, all it takes is one time to happen for people to start thinking, okay, how do we figure this out to be prepared in case something else happens in the future?
Yeah, and to that point, I know there was a couple of weeks ago, there was some, I think it was either introduced in the House or maybe by some senators that proposed amending the National Labor Relations Act to allow electronic voting. So it'll be interesting to see if, some of the new age ways of voting, if that's something that gains any steam. I don't imagine
Mm.
right now it will, but that's something that at least some lawmakers are thinking about, given what's going on now, and that it is difficult to kind of have these elections and have employees vote at the
Yeah.
present.
Yeah, I mean that's the topic right now. I think the
Yeah,
president was tweeting about it.
yeah, maybe right now as we speak. Yeah,
Probably. Definitely likes his tweets. That's for sure. I obviously a lot of times collective bargaining is dictated not only by what the employer wants or the union wants, but also what the state and local laws outline out there. Was there anything out of the ordinary that was being put out there by states or localities that created conflict between the union and the employer?
Yeah, I think the biggest area was the sick leave and the paid leave areas
Mm-hmm.
where, as we talked about before, what's happened here is that there's for any employer who operates in more than one state, or in some instances even within one state, different cities, there's all sorts of sick leave laws that exist. And then as a result of, COVID-19, there was federal laws passed and state laws passed in many states providing employees with entitlements to leave, both if they themselves contracted COVID-19, if they are a caregiver for someone who has it. So there were amendments made to the FMLA. There was leave entitled to employees under state law, federal law, dependent on the size of the employer. So all sorts of issues, which in some cases conflicted with, the leave entitlements employees had prior to that. So how to mesh
Yeah.
all these things together, I think, is where there's been a lot of confusion, given that, these things were coming down, in rapid fashion from the states, from the federal government. And to their credit, they were trying to make sure that employees were able to have leave and that leave be paid in certain circumstances. So I understand why legislature had to act quickly. But because of that, a lot of employers were left talking to the unions about how are we going to implement this, not knowing, what the next day's law was going to be. So that was the big thing right up front that I know a lot of folks were struggling with, both union and non-union, but especially where those contracts weren't really accounting for those type of things. And some of those laws didn't have carve-outs saying, this doesn't apply if you're covered by a collective bargaining agreement, which is what some of these state and local sick leave laws say, that if you have a collective bargaining in place, that trumps this as long as the benefits that the employees are given are the same.
Correct. I see. So what about, did you encounter situations where this hero pay or extra pay was an issue? I can imagine that it was.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of employers, including ones I work with, who have employees who are essential workers, did give employees raises, but you have to bargain that, with the union. You can't just go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
They were bargaining. There was maybe some discussions about those, monetary increases, but also then what are you going to do in terms of leave related issues and, other issues that, furloughs that employers tried to negotiate altogether. So, and now the issue is how long is that going to continue for? I know some employers have had some issues where we're going to curtail making those payments, and how is that going to shake out, and whether they can or not depends on obviously if they've entered into an agreement with the union. But especially those non-union employers have been taking some heat, in terms of limiting those payments. But even if you wanted as an employer to give those in the unionized environment, you have to bargain with the union about it.
Correct. Yeah. I remember, I called it the lollipop. Once you give the lollipop, if you're not negotiating for it, you can't take away that lollipop, right?
Yeah. Everything's a give and take.
That's right. It's a give and take. So, just a couple of things. We talked a little bit about remote work. I remember prior to my departure from my prior employer, Crescent, I know that a topic of debate was the whole idea of having to provide unions with email addresses. Was that ever sorted out? Is that now part of the protocol, or is still up in the air?
Sure. So now when there's an election and an employer has to provide a voter list as part of that process. So if a petition is filed by a group of employees, the NLRB gets involved, they order an election, the employer has to give a voter list. And on that voter list, the employer has to provide the names, the shift, the addresses, and also home, cell, and email address if that's something that the employer uses. So, this way, if especially in these times, we were talking about how a campaign looks,
Yeah.
likely there's a lot more email communication going out to those eligible voters. And now the employer has to provide that information if they have it. If you don't have it or you don't use it, you don't have to go and ask your employees, hey, what's your email address? But if it's something that you regularly use to communicate with your employees and you have it, then you have to provide that information.
So talking a little bit about the NLRB, are there any hot topics right now, either in light of coronavirus or not related to it, that are being discussed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing right now, which is timely, is that there's new election rules that are supposed to be going into place for any election petition filed at the end of the month. Back during the Obama presidency, the NLRB issued what's known as the quickie election rules, where things happen quicker than they did prior to that in terms of the turnaround time to get to an election. The current NLRB has rolled out new rules that slow that down a bit and provide a bit more time from when a petition is filed to when there is a hearing to when the vote takes place, and make some other changes to how elections are administered by the NLRB. That's scheduled to go into effect again, early next week. There's some court actions pending trying to challenge the NLRB's ability to implement that in the manner in which it did, kind of on a procedural issue. So that's a hot button one, because new petitions filed next week could be operating under different laws than ones that were filed today, for instance. So that'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Some other issues, the joint employer issue was a big one for employers, and the NLRB has kind of been right in the middle of that controversy over the past few years. In February, which seems like a lifetime ago, the NLRB rolled out its final rules regarding joint employer status. That took effect in April. So, that's been a big issue for employers, especially trying to figure out when is a joint employer relationship between two separate entities. That's a big thing in all avenues of employment law, but the NLRB, again, has been kind of right smack dab in the middle of it. And, there's been other changes as well in terms of, again, the cycle of the NLRB is a lot of times depending on who's in office. There's the 3-2 majority, minority in terms of those people on the board. So there's been a rolling back of certain changes that were made under the Obama presidency, and some new decisions that have, changed or refined the act or the law in terms of how it's interpreted with respect to employee handbooks. And things like that. So there's a lot going on at the board, and as talked about before, they're doing Zoom hearings, and for elections they're doing the mail ballot and then Zoom or WebEx based ballot counts. So the NLRB has been open, other than for a couple of weeks where things were paused, and they're really trying to move ahead and more so than a lot of federal courts and state courts that we deal with. The NLRB has been moving along, and their employees, the ones that I've been dealing with who are working from home, are being responsive, getting back to the parties, and really trying to facilitate things moving forward.
That entire process must be fascinating, having to deal with all of this, and now all of a sudden the NLRB jumping into Zoom and trying to figure out how to maneuver this entire process. Obviously, unions are on an all-time low in the United States, and I don't know how much of coronavirus puts a hindrance in that process. But obviously, you work primarily with employers, defending employers when it comes to working with unions. It's an election year. Is there anything that you've seen that is now a movement that the union is picking up based on either starting with, precedents, right? Biden and Trump. Clearly, they're going to go for Biden versus going for Trump. But is there anything else that is happening that you guys are preparing for, because the union is now taking action to try to gain some momentum?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things, both in terms of coronavirus and kind of what's going on now. In terms of what's going on now, we are seeing an uptick in union activity. You have a lot of employees, especially those who are at work right now, safety and security of themselves, their families, and the unions are trying to, to some extent where maybe they haven't made inroads at certain employers or industries, are trying to do so now. So a lot of unions have set up websites. If you're an employee who need help with this issue, or you're having an issue with safety, security, or you've tested positive for COVID-19 and are unhappy with how your employer is handling it, contact us. So I think there is that level of, activity on social media and the like that unions are trying to use to kind of reverse, that trend you spoke about earlier, where, their union percentages in the private sector are, I think about 6% right now for private sector employees. I think in terms of the election year, I think Biden, the PRO Act is the piece of legislation that passed the House of Representatives that, for those who remember back about 10 or so years ago, maybe more, it was the Employee Free Choice Act, which was the legislation that President Obama, when he was running, was supporting, and then it didn't really get implemented as it was imagined initially, but some bits and pieces of it did. The PRO Act is the new version of that, and that would really amend the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, in a lot of key ways, by increasing the penalties that the NLRB could issue. It would ban certain employer meetings, such as those ones that we worked on in your prior position, in terms of those meetings with employees, captive audience meetings or the like. It would prohibit those and really enable the NLRB to issue penalties on employers for bargaining and bad faith and the like, and things like that. So candidate Biden Vice President Biden has a whole page on his website dedicated to union issues, and his support for the PRO Act and the like. So again, we don't imagine right now it's going to go anywhere because it's passed the House. We don't imagine it going anywhere to the Senate or whether the president would sign it. But that's the thing that, all the candidates were supporting on the Democratic side. And now that, Joe Biden's a presumptive nominee, he's, full throttle supporting, those issues. Yeah. And I think there's all sorts of things that unions are, for instance, back 5, 6, 7 years ago, the Fight for 15 was a union started movement to get the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. And now that's been successful in a lot of states. So, that still continues in terms of those states that haven't reached that level. So, unions are trying to, insert themselves and make themselves relevant in all sorts of ways, even if it's not necessarily getting more members, but, just trying to move the things along in terms of the legislative front as well.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, obviously, I've been away from union environments for at least now 2.5 years. And like I said, I have a love-hate relationship because there's something exciting about the negotiation process. But I can only imagine particularly this environment, the tension. The coronavirus situation was stressful enough on its own, right? And now all of a sudden you have to negotiate, you have to discuss, you have to involve that other party, in this case, the union. And now they have a say, they have input. And now you have to consider that and the back and forth. I can only imagine how stressful it must have been. Just going through the process of thinking about everything that you can possibly think of in any environment. And now you have, on top of that, the union saying, hold on, we have a say on this. And you're like, oh, crap, I forgot about that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it was one of those things where, when the labor management relationship, works well for those employers that have, established relationships going on with unions. I mean, I think in a lot of instances, the parties approach it from the same mindset of, we need to make sure our employees are safe. But I think, to your point, it was very stressful because the speed at which this happened was pretty quickly. It went from 1 week, as long as you had your Purell in your hand and you used it after you went out to grab lunch or you're on a train, you're okay, to all right, you can't go to your office now. So I think the way that happened was so quick that I think, tough times make tough people. And I think here there was a real coming together, for labor management, and examples both I was involved with, as well as I'm sure countless others, where the parties were able to put their differences aside and reach agreements to ensure the safety as much as possible of their workforce, but also to keep those operations that were permitted to remain open by the state and local governments to remain open. So to your point, it was a stressful time, but it was like that for everybody. But that obligation to bargain, not just implement, was an added hurdle for those employers. Or have unions in there representing their workers.
Yeah, I remember, once you get over the theatrics of the process and get to the nitty gritty, and let's just talk about these issues. I found myself many times just having good conversations and trying to solve problems. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that if I had been in that environment, it would have been the same. Longer days, a little bit more stress, but at the end of the day, you have to get over whatever the issues are and say, let's talk about this. Let's figure it out, because clearly this is new for everybody. I think that's the common ground, right? Everybody says, hey, what do we do?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen one yet, but I'd love to see that contract that had a COVID-19 policy applied to it. I think everyone was trying to figure out, the way forward, but no one was really planning for this or a situation like this. So I think a lot of it was, let's do what we can to, make sure that, again, for those employers who are able to operate, we can have our employees at work safely, but we try to, honor as much as we can the agreements. But at the same time, we have to comply with whatever the mandates of the federal or state government are in terms of who we can have at work, how many people we can have at work, and then are now, as we bring people back, how many people are we allowed to bring back, or recall. A lot of contracts have provisions, if you've done a layoff, how you bring people back, but you may not be able to follow that to the letter of the agreement based on, what the state says. I mean, and again, in New York, there's the 4-phased opening approach, and then there's other CDC guidelines. Those guidelines change as we learn more information about the disease. So, it's an ever evolving issue, which, makes our jobs more complicated, but, exciting and at the same time.
I can imagine the number of grievances are going to increase pretty quickly when, he got called before I was supposed to get called. And then sometimes it takes weeks and months, and then you have to go retro. I can imagine it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, there's all sorts of interesting things, both in the union and, non-union environment. I mean, we've seen the idea being brought about of some employees claiming discriminatory retention. What does that mean? Discriminatory retention? I don't understand. Because of the changes in unemployment, in terms of additional benefits, you have some employees who are, would prefer to get unemployment benefits rather than work. So there's been issues of, hey, I was made to show up to work every day versus this other person who's been allowed to sit at home and collect unemployment. So that was a discriminatory decision. So again, you think of discriminatory discharge. I was terminated, not I was allowed to keep my job. But, so if that's an example of kind of the new world we're living in, it shows that, there's all bets are off in terms of the type of issues that we're going to be seeing, now and going forward.
Yeah, I can imagine new provisions coming up from this. Wow, that's interesting. I didn't think about it, but it's true. It's something that we have talked about, that, some individuals are earning more staying home than being at work. But I didn't think about it in that manner. Well, you were keeping me, but you're discriminating against me because you're keeping me. And you go like, what?
Yeah.
No, it's usually the other way.
Yeah. No, I mean, but that's something that, and we'll see whether or not the unemployment provisions that were added by the federal government get extended beyond July. But as employers are starting to reopen, more and more they're dealing with those type of issues of bringing people back and whether you can come back. Whether if you're at home and if your children, if you're the primary caregiver and your children has school canceled, what you're entitled to. So, there's all sorts of issues and, lots of, unique ones that, you can't open the playbook in terms of how to deal with it.
No playbook. The playbook is being written as we speak.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Listen, Howard, I really appreciate you joining me today. It's been great. This is a topic that I really enjoy talking about. Obviously, you're with Seyfarth, focus on labor employment law. Is there anything happening at Seyfarth? Are there any webinars, anything that you guys want to plug in since I have you now on the show?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have, daily emails that go out. We have our COVID-19 mailing list you could sign up for, where we have all sorts of webinars, both on now, especially we're focused on reopening. So we've done those, on state levels. And we also have those non-labor and employment issues as well, the PPP loans and things like that. So on our website, we have a whole page dedicated to COVID and COVID related issues where you could sign up to get our daily email, where we have a summary of all of our alerts and then upcoming webinars as well. So there's a lot of material out there. I'm sure folks like you are getting bombarded with emails from all sorts of companies. So
Yes.
we try to make it narrow down so you get one email from us at least a day with everything in there. So you're not, deleting 75 emails from us.
from people.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Howard, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming in or joining me today. And I guess we'll remain connected via LinkedIn. And who knows if we end up working together in the future.
Sounds great. It was great catching up with you. And thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night.
You too.